Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I'm going to revisit the same book I was looking at last time, Darwinism and Human Affairs by Richard Alexander. A good book. Last time I focused entirely on Chapter 1. There are only 4 chapters in this book. This episode I'm going to focus on Chapter 2, although I do have a few readings from the early parts of Chapter 3. The rest of Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 I'm going to skip over, although they are good. They're not quite as fundamental as the other parts here. So, Chapter 1 was really like an overview of Darwinism and group selection and inclusive fitness and kin selection and kind of like an overview of things. The second chapter is called Natural Selection and Culture. And he begins in this section to talk about cultural evolution and some of the qualities of culture, how cultural evolution relates to genetic evolution, how they're different, how they're similar, how they relate to one another. The first chapter didn't really talk much about culture, but a big part of evolutionary psychology is understanding the connections between culture and genetic evolution, and understanding the ways in which our genetics drives the shape of our culture. And so I've got a couple sections from here that I'm going to read, like always, provide a little bit of commentary about what I've read. Without an awful lot of delay, let me jump right in here and start reading from the beginning when he's talking about natural selection and culture, where he says, quote, "If human evolution, like that of other organisms, has significantly involved selection effects at genic levels, realized through the reproductive strivings of individuals, neither humans as individuals nor the human species as a whole have had a single course to chart in the development of culture, but rather a very large number of slightly different and potentially conflicting courses. In this case, it would indeed be difficult to locate a function for, or even the functions of, culture. Instead, culture would chiefly be, as Solin's view might be slightly modified to mean, the central aspect of the environment, into which every person is born, and where one must succeed or fail, developed gradually by the collections of humans that have preceded us in history, and with an inertia refractory to the wishes of individuals, and even of small and large groups. Culture would represent the cumulative effects of what Hamilton called inclusive fitness maximizing behavior, i.e. reproductive maximization via all socially available descendant and non-descendant relatives, by all humans who have lived. I regard this as a reasonable theory to explain the existence and nature of culture, and the rates and directions of its change. If this theory is correct, then each of us should find some aspects of culture objectionable. Seldom would any of its aspects be viewed with equal good humor by all of us, and in just this circumstance we would not expect easy success for grand utilitarian views of culture, general theories of culture, or efforts at deliberate guidance of societal change. These are exactly the kinds of failures that have always plagued culture theorists." End quote. So he's basically saying that, what we've seen so far in Chapter 1 should lead us to believe that culture is something that is not a grand operation, and he says in this case, in other words, in the case in which culture is the aggregate of the reproductive strivings of individuals, both in their own genetic reproduction as well as in their efforts toward inclusive fitness, in other words, their own efforts at nepotism and kin group selection. All these different individual strivings constitute culture, and it's really an aggregate of potentially competing courses, potentially competing drives of individuals. And so, in this case, not everyone is going to necessarily find everything about culture works for him or her, because there are other people who have structured culture to work for them, and you are not them, and they've got culture in certain ways advancing their interests, and you've got culture in other certain ways advancing your interests, and their interests were laid down by their ancestors, and the parts of culture that benefit you were largely laid down by your ancestors. And so it's not the case that every part of culture is going to work for every person. Just because of this aggregate and the fact that all the different members of a culture all have slightly different interests. They generally want the culture to not fail, assuming that they see themselves as participants in that culture, and they see that if the culture fails, they will fail with it. In that case, they generally want to see culture succeed. Like the people of Athens generally don't want Athens to be sacked and burned to the ground. Their interests are bound up with Athens, and similarly in the United States, people's interests, generally speaking, are bound up with the interests of the United States. Although when a nation gets so large, the competing interests of different subgroups within it become as powerful as small nations in their own right. So it might be an indication, following this line of thought, that there is such a thing as a nation that is too big, given the power of the various competing interest groups that reside within it. But at any rate, he says that given this case, we should not expect easy success for grand utilitarian views of culture, general theories of culture, or efforts at deliberate guidance of societal change. So, yeah, I mean, culture is basically the sort of thing that it kind of grows organically, right? All these people slightly pushing and nudging and changing, some people with more power, some people with less power, but each of them pushing in their own way to move culture in a direction that benefits them. That's a sort of organic growth, and the idea that one can just come up with some sort of grand plan and rebuild society according to it, often such efforts lead to failure. The lack of organic growth leads to all sorts of unforeseen consequences. Organic growth has had to contend with various circumstances and overcome them, and has developed mechanisms for overcoming perhaps mechanisms like, for example, biologically, we have mechanisms for overcoming circumstances that we may not find ourselves in. In other words, you have the capacity to create calluses on your hands. If you live a soft life and you don't really work with your hands, you may never encounter the circumstance whereby that mechanism comes into play. And similarly, culture may have components to it that arise or are activated in certain circumstances based on situations that people have been in the past, and in the present we're not in those situations, and those circumstances don't arise. There are all sorts of things that we don't entirely understand about culture and about our history, that it's like Chesterton's gate, we shouldn't necessarily mess with it because we don't always understand it. And for those reasons, these grand schemes have a tendency to fail. They don't always take into account all of the various interests of the participants in society. So, moving on from there, he talks about cultural inertia, which is sort of what we're hinting at in this section. He says, quote, "The inertia of culture has suggested to some anthropologists that individuals, even great persons, have scarcely any impact upon its nature and its direction or rates of change. I suggest that this is not because culture is non-functional or mysterious, but because the underlying pattern of conflicting interests has been too complex and too poorly understood to be grasped within a single framework. Yet by the theory developed here, the inertia of culture would exist because individuals and subgroups had influenced its direction and shape, molding it, even if imperceptibly across short periods of time, to suit their particular needs, thereby incidentally increasing the likelihood that subsequent individuals and subgroups could find ways to use it to their own advantages as well, and could not alter it so greatly or rapidly. Some confusion may derive from the fact that reproductive efforts by individuals would not necessarily be directed at changing culture, nor would such efforts lead to any particular directions of change in culture as a whole. Instead, the striving of individuals would be to use culture, whether or not change were entailed, to further their own reproduction. No necessary correlation would be expected between the success of an individual's striving and the magnitude of the individual's effect on cultural change, or between the collective success of the individuals making up a group or society and the rate of cultural change. It would not matter if one were a legislator making laws, a judge interpreting them, a policeman enforcing them, a lawyer using them, a citizen obeying or circumventing them, or a criminal violating them. Each of these behaviors can be seen as a particular strategy within a society governed by law, and each has some possibility of success. They are efforts, by and large, to exploit rather than change culture. It would tend to be contrary to the interests of the members of society that cultural changes of any magnitude could easily be effected by individuals, except for inventions seen as likely to benefit nearly everyone. The reasons are that 1. Changes affected by individuals or subgroups in their own interests would probably be contrary to the interests of others, and 2. Once individuals had selected and were carrying out a particular set of responses to the existing culture in their own interests, changes of almost any sort would have some likelihood of being deleterious to them. These arguments not only suggest how anthropological interpretations of culture may be entirely compatible with the notion of reproductive striving, principally effective at the individual or genic level, but they may also explain in part the genesis of the peculiar views from within some branches of anthropology that culture is somehow independent of individuals and groups and their wishes and not easily explainable in any kind of utilitarian terms. End quote. So here he's just basically saying culture has a sort of inertia because of the reasons that I had been speaking of. People have set up aspects of culture in larger ways or smaller ways. They've influenced culture to benefit them, and it's therefore somewhat likely that the ways in which culture has proven to benefit them, or they've made culture benefit them, would in turn benefit their descendants or some other person who was able to find a similar way of utilizing culture. And as culture is shifted in ways that benefit the people who have the capacity to move it and change it, it becomes solidified. It's not as likely to undergo change because it hasn't undergone change in the past. The people who would change it from its current course haven't had the capacity to do so in the past and probably don't have the capacity to do so in the present. It sort of falls into a pattern of reinforcement. The people that can change it have changed it to their benefit, and they're not interested in changing it in any other way. Of course, if it becomes too damaging to some particular group of people, then uprisings can occur, and the efforts at change become more pronounced and more powerful, the more harmful some aspects of culture may be to some participant in culture. And so you see the point is it just sort of naturally and organically evens itself out, smooths out the rough edges, begins to operate like a well-oiled machine over the course of time. And he says that the inertia that we see in culture, he points out two reasons for it. The first of which is that changes affected by individuals or subgroups in their own interests would probably be contrary to the interests of others. So anytime anyone tries to change culture, there's always going to be some group that's harmed by that and is going to push back. And the second is really kind of similar to the first, oddly. He says, once individuals had selected and were carrying out a particular set of responses to the existing culture in their own interests, any change is going to have some likelihood of being deleterious to them. It almost seems like two ways of saying the same thing. But the point is that it might seem that culture, and it may be argued by some that culture doesn't have anything to do with individuals' interests. It's its own thing, operates on by its own rules, and the will of people isn't really relevant. It's people don't really have control over their culture. Now, I think that extreme view can fairly easily be disregarded. People do push culture in particular directions, and it may be less likely that one person is going to push culture on his own power in this way or that way, although people who have a lot of money or a lot of influence can certainly push culture more than the average person. But a group movement is really nothing but a bunch of individual people who have all come to an agreement to do a certain thing, and those sorts of group movements definitely have an impact on culture. Anyway, let's move to the next section. He begins to talk about the similarities and differences between the ways that culture evolves and the ways that that genetic evolution occurs, the ways that our biology evolves over time. He says, quote, "It is possible to examine the problem of cultural change in a fashion parallel to that used earlier to analyze evolutionary change. We can consider the effects of the same 5 processes that characterize genetic change." The most closely parallel argument is probably that of Murdoch from 1960. Inheritance. Just as the morphological, physiological, and behavioral traits of organisms are heritable through consistency in the development environment, the traits of culture are also heritable through learning. They may be imitated, plagiarized, or taught. Mutation. Like the genetic materials, culture is also mutable through mistakes, but also through discoveries, inventions, or deliberate planning, Murdoch's variations, inventions, and tentations. Selection. As with the phenotypic traits of organisms, some traits of culture in some fashion by their effects reinforce their own persistence and spread. Others do not, and eventually disappear for that reason. Murdoch's social acceptance, integration, and selective elimination. Drift. As with genetic units, traits of culture can also be lost by accident or sampling error. The last stonemason may die without passing on his knowledge. Or the ship full of dissident emigrants may sail to found a new society without anyone realizing there is no stonemason on board. Isolation. As with populations of other kinds of organisms, different human societies become separated by extrinsic and intrinsic barriers. They diverge, and they may contact and remerge or continue to drift apart. Items and aspects of culture may spread by diffusion, Murdoch's cultural diffusion and cultural borrowing. Immediately, differences are apparent between the processes of change during genetic and cultural evolution. Perhaps most profoundly, causes of mutation and selection in cultural evolution, unlike those in genetic evolution, are not independent. Most of the sources of cultural mutations are at least potentially related to the reasons for their survival or failure. A new kind of plow or computer is built for its expected usefulness. It is adopted if it works. Some cultural theorists have nevertheless denied utilitarian connections between the usual sources or causes of cultural change and the reasons for their survival or failure. I suggest that one reason for these denials is that such theorists have never sought function in terms of reproduction at the individual level, as biologists now realize must be the case in organic evolution. Some, such as Franz Boas, Ruth Benedict, Frederick Barth, and eventually George Peter Murdoch, have emphasized the role of the individual in culture, and some, such as Bronislaw Malinowski, A.R. Radcliffe Brown, and Roy A. Rappaport, have emphasized function as survival value, usually for the group or population, but sometimes for the individual. Still others, with a psychological background, have argued that responses to the cultural environment by individuals are best analyzed at efforts at drive reduction. None of the cultural theorists, however, have seen function as reproductive value. Instead, most functionalists have either sought group-level utilitarian effects or have regarded as crucial the survival of the individual, but not its genetic reproduction. Among current authors, Salins perhaps best exemplifies the rejection of functional explanations of culture, denying both individual-level and group-level utilitarianism. Malinowski's functional theory of culture, although in striking contrast to approaches like that of Salins, was equally unsatisfactory, because it was couched in terms of satisfying immediate physiological needs. As with learning theory and other theories that stop with proximate mechanisms, it could not account for the existence of those needs, any more than Salins' theory can account for either the existence or nature of symbols. Salins was led to the conclusion that for Malinowski, culture represented a gigantic metaphorical extension of the digestive system. Malinowski's theory, though, would have made sense if only he had seen culture as a gigantic metaphorical extension of the reproductive system. End quote. Okay, so what do we have here? At the end there, Well, let me actually start in the beginning. The first thing he does is he draws some comparisons. If you'll remember in the last episode when he talked about 5 qualities of genetics that allowed for genetic evolution. Those were inheritance, mutation, selection, drift, and isolation. And he says that culture really has all of those same 5 features. So we should expect that culture undergoes a sort of evolution as well. Cultural artifacts, memes, ideas, words, tools, technologies, patterns of behavior, all of these things can be compared sort of to like genes, and they affect human behavior, and they may be successful or they may be less successful at their reproduction. And they will presumably, generally, these cultural memes, if you will reproduce and spread and be selected for if the carriers of these memes, the humans, are successful. If you adopt a cultural pattern that causes your people to die off, that cultural pattern won't be adopted by other people who will either recognize its failure or will otherwise not have an opportunity to learn from you because your culture has died off. So if a cultural concept brings ruin to the people who adopt it, it doesn't get passed on. If a cultural meme brings you success, other people will imitate it, and it will allow your culture to advance and spread. This is sort of the general system that you would expect. Now, it's also been proposed by some, I think Dawkins in particular, that some cultural memes reproduce well, but they don't necessarily have to, by definition, be particularly beneficial to people who adopt them. Something that could be really beneficial and yet difficult to understand might not spread as well, whereas something that is simple and easy to understand and perhaps in a way intuitive and yet not helpful for one reason or another might actually spread very well despite the fact that it's not really useful. So it's not always necessarily the case that usefulness to the human carriers of these memes is always paired up with the success of the memes. If the memes are successful on their own while being detrimental to its carrier, you might call that something like a mind virus. It spreads, it's it's subject to social contagions. For any of various reasons, the mental meme, the idea, spreads despite the fact that it's ultimately harmful. Such a thing can certainly be imagined to exist. But so there's the inheritance of it, the way that it's learned from one person to another. It's either imitated or it's taught to other people. It mutates, in other words, it changes. Sometimes accidentally it changes, sometimes it's deliberately changed. There's a selection process, as I've talked about. They may reinforce, he says, some of them by their effects reinforce their own persistence and spread, and others don't. There's a sort of drift. In other words, there's a sort of an accidental aspect of it. A stone that some people may set out for a new land and realize that certain skills were not on the boat when they set out, and so when they get to the new place, they have to sort of reinvent some of these skills, and they reinvent them in a new way, and on account of that, it's sort of an accident of circumstance, but the useful skill is not passed on. Someone dies before they pass on their skill. Certain other things can happen. People can imitate something and he talks about this a little bit, how someone can start, someone of in a powerful position, a king or someone who's influential can have a habit, a way of speaking, terminology, something about them, a way of gesturing with their hands or something that because of their success in life or whatever because of their social status, that may be imitated, even though it's not necessarily beneficial outright on its own. Like I believe the Spanish king at one point had a lisp, and the whole Spanish language kind of altered to adopt the lisp of the king. I don't know how true that is, but I've heard that. That's not a beneficial thing in and of itself, but people did it to be in the good graces of the king, and it sort of spiraled out of control. Things like that. That's the sort of mode of cultural drift. And then lastly would be isolation. In order for, like, genetically, in order for there to be separate species, different animals have to be different enough to not be able to breed with one another. They have to be separated geographically. They have to be in some way isolated from one another in order for multiple species to exist, for one species to branch out into subspecies geographically isolated, the Indian elephant and the African elephant or whatever, and they, over the course of millions of years, they diverge into separate species, right? The species diverge and is constantly splitting off, and some branches die off and others succeed, and then those will then branch again in the future. So they branch because of isolation. Otherwise, they would just stay one species. But the people or the animals or whatever, the entities in one place evolve along one course, and in another place evolve along another course. And so long as that applies culturally, which it clearly does, we have different languages, we have different cultures, modes of dress, modes of food. We have the same geographic isolation from one another. Cultures diverge in the same way because they were subject to the same sort of methods of isolation. We have oceans separating us in some cases. It's not necessarily the case that we're super isolated today, but in the conditions in which culture developed, we largely were isolated from one another. And so because we have these same 5 features to culture that we have to genetics, we can expect similar sort of cultural evolution. But he also says that one interesting thing about culture is that the method of mutation and the method of selection are not isolated. Like in genetics, mutation occurs at the genetic level. It's on account of, radiation or just changes, failures in the gene building apparatus, just various methods by which the DNA mutates from parent to child. Just variations are introduced. That really has nothing to do with the selection process, which is a phenotypical phenomena where your body survives or doesn't survive on account of its interactions with the environment and with other people. There's no direct cause that your genes, usually your genes themselves, are being selected directly. Your body's being selected by the environment, and so the causes of your selection and the causes of your genetic mutations are more or less 2 completely separate spheres of activity. Whereas in culture, things mutate specifically because of the anticipated selection process. We'll invent something new because we see a need for it. We see that we have to do something different because we see a threat. We perceive a threat. We make a change. We build a city because we recognize that the city will be successful here. And so we isolate ourselves. We select ourselves. We participate in the selection, and we change in response to changing environments. So the selection and the mutation are bound up with one another. So that's an interesting fact that makes it slightly different, and we would have to account for that as we study cultural evolution. Now, what I think is interesting is how he says that one reason for some cultural theorists have denied utilitarian connections between the sources or causes of cultural change and the reasons for their survival or failure. In other words, the connection between the mutation and the selection. He suggests that one reason for those denials is that these theorists have never sought function in terms of reproduction at the individual level. So the success or failure of individual reproduction is the real source of changes to culture. People are striving, right? I mean, it's kind of like moving through layers of means and ends. People are striving to replicate their genes. Therefore, they strive to reproduce. They also strive to survive, but they strive to survive because they're driven to survive because their genes direct them to survive in order to facilitate the replication. It all comes down to the genetic replication. and the strivings of people to reproduce and to survive are the actions, deliberate, subconscious, or instinctive, that force us to make the changes to culture. And so all cultural change can ultimately be boiled down to the drive toward reproduction. So he says that the reason for these failures, or the reason for the denials, I should say, of the connections, he says, is that theorists have never sought a function in terms of reproduction at the individual level. He says some people have emphasized the role of the individual in culture, and some people have emphasized function in survival value, usually for the group or population, the survival of the group, but sometimes for the survival of the individual. Some people with a psychological background have argued that the cultural environment is the responses to the cultural environment are described as drive reduction. He doesn't go into an awful lot of detail there, but he says none of the cultural theorists have seen function as reproductive value. Most functionalists, in other words, most of the theorists that talk about the culture having this function or that function, have sought group-level utilitarian effects, or have regarded as crucial the survival of the individual, but not its genetic reproduction. He says some authors, like Salins, reject all functional explanations of culture. They deny the individual level and the group level utilitarianism. He gives a quote there from Salins, but I won't read that. But then he mentions Malinowski, who has a functional theory of culture, and it contrasts to Salins, but it's also in terms of satisfying physiological needs. So as a result, Salins criticizes Malinowski's functionalism, saying that Salins says that Malinowski's view of culture is that culture is essentially a gigantic metaphorical extension of the digestive system, but it would have made more sense if he was criticizing it if Malinowski had seen it as a giant metaphorical extension of the reproductive system. Now, there's not that, I think he might be splitting hairs here, because the only reason that we have a digestive system is to keep us alive long enough to reproduce. Right? I mean, if it all comes down to reproduction, then even though we are shifting society modifying society and building society in such a way that it keeps the food flowing, in such a way that it's an extension of our digestive system. The whole process of society exists to put food on our plates, to feed us. But the only reason we put food on our plates and feed ourselves is ultimately so that we can replicate our genes. So if the digestive system is an extension of the reproductive system, then the culture being an extension of the digestive system could certainly be interpreted as an extension of the reproductive system as well. His point here is that culture doesn't just exist to put food on our plates. It exists to help us reproduce, in theory, help us reproduce successfully. But I think that most aspects of culture are really more obviously geared toward our survival. I mean, if you consider that, animals in the wild reproduce, we don't necessarily need culture to reproduce. I think that we would be perfectly capable of reproducing without culture, no matter what sort of society you look at, no matter how advanced or primitive. Reproduction happens, and in fact, reproduction often happens more prolifically at lower levels of technology and lower levels of quote-unquote civilization. So if civilization is an extension of the reproductive system, one might say it's a failed extension of the reproductive system, insofar as the birth rates of the most civilized nations are in fact the lowest. It really functions much more effectively at keeping us alive for a longer period of time. Our lifespan is markedly increased. We live longer, we live healthier lives, less injuries, presumably less injuries, less illnesses, and just longer lifespans with less physical destruction. And I think that perhaps, just speculating here, perhaps we've gone so too far in the wrong direction, where Western nations are being overrun by third world nations, and the excuse is often given that, well, we're not reproducing enough, and so we need to, our civilizations will go extinct if we don't import a bunch of people from the more prolific nations, the more reproductively prolific nations where birth rates are really high, and they're exporting their extra population. They're pushing their extra population out elsewhere because they're growing so fast they can't keep up. They can't keep up with food and supplies and infrastructure, and they just keep pushing the excess population off into the more civilized nations that can't seem to figure out how to reproduce. What's a more successful strategy in the long run when you think about the fact that we're not really after, our goal as animals is not to craft a first world society or to craft a civilization that is advanced. Our objective as biological entities is to reproduce successfully and to spread our genetic code across the surface of the earth. That's what every living animal seeks to do at some basic biological genetic level. Replicate the code, right? We are survival machines, but we're not just survival machines, we're replication machines. The genes don't survive, as I said in the last episode. The genes decay. When you die, your genes all rot, just like the rest of your body. It's the code that you're after, the survival of the pattern. And if the pattern exists in your offspring, and you have lots of offspring, then you are genetically successful. And if you have no offspring, then you are genetically unsuccessful. So having a civilized society that fails to reproduce itself is, in an evolutionary, from an evolutionary perspective, that is a losing strategy. So I think that it's important that we keep in mind, really, that societies should be facilitating the spread of our genetic code. And if our society is not facilitating the replication and spread of our genetic codes, then that society is hampering us, not helping us. It's hampering us. It's restraining us. It is suppressing our reproductive capacities, not facilitating it. So let me move on to the next section. He talks about more about the connection between genetic and cultural evolution. He says, quote, "Unlike genetic evolution, cultural change involves a positive feedback between need and novelty. Whereas genetic evolution is characterized by a lower rate of mutations, cultural inertia derives from the conflicts of interest among individuals and subgroups, from power distributions that result in stalemates, and from the incidental long-term persistence of some cultural institutions. This means that culture as a whole will not be seen as maximizing group interests. The reinforcement between need and novelty, together with efforts by individuals and subgroups to modify culture in their own interests, means that cultural change may be expected to continue accelerating compared to rates of genetic evolution. This divergence, I believe, will make it increasingly difficult to interpret current human behavior in terms of history, because the acceleration of rates of appearance of novelties will decrease the abilities or tendencies of individuals to follow their own genetic interests. The acceleration of cultural change will also increasingly become apparent as the source of novel ethical problems, which are bound to increase in number and severity as cultural change accelerates. Ethical problems derive from conflicts of interest, and as technology and social structure become more complex, conflicts of interests must also become more numerous and complex. In recent years, novel ethical problems have begun to appear almost daily in the popular press. They involve topics like euthanasia, abortion, birth control, food additives, permissible levels of pollution, drug use, safety levels in automobiles, tolerance of divergent lifestyles, discrimination against minorities, and freedom from surveillance. Most recent and current efforts to relate genetic change and cultural change, it seems to me, have actually been efforts to divorce them, to explain why and how culture and genes came uncoupled during human history. These arguments generally assume that such uncoupling is essentially synonymous with the appearance of culture, that culture is, by definition, a disengagement of human behavior from the effects of genes. For those who regard the advent of culture as little more than an uncoupling of human behavior and its effects from the differential reproduction of genetic alternatives, there seems to be no reason whatever for a connection between the nature of cultural changes and the causes of selection of genetic replicators. They see what Cloak called cultural instructions and what Dawkins called memes or cultural replicators as changing independently of the effects of natural selection on genetic replicators. This view seems faulty to me. There is every reason to expect a correlation between cultural change and inclusive fitness maximizing. If none had existed, the capacity for culture could not have evolved by natural selection of genetic alternatives. End quote. So he's essentially saying here that, first of all, he talks about, the first part just doesn't make much sense to me. He talks about the inertia. He says cultural inertia. He says, whereas genetic evolution is characterized by a lowered rate of mutations. In other words, over time, the number of mutations decreases because evolution is, in a way, trying to reinforce itself. Your genes are trying to replicate, and the gene doesn't replicate when it mutates. It either replicates itself in its completeness, or it mutates into something else, which is not really entirely a replication. So your genes over time, they've sort of settled into their genetic niche, their environmental niche, and they've found the mechanism that works, and the genetic code mutates less as ways of enforcing accurate genetic replication begin to be implemented. Whereas in culture, the rate of change and the rate of mutation is accelerating, which I think clearly it is. But his reason for why it is accelerating doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me. He says cultural inertia, so the failure, the failure of culture to change, the tendency of culture to stay the same. He says the cultural inertia derives from the conflicts of interest among individuals and subgroups, from power distributions that result in stalemates, and from the incidental long-term persistence of some cultural institutions. Which presumably seems to mean that the inertia is driven by phenomena that are not perhaps as stable and as immune to change and mutation as genetics are. If inertia results from is the output of conflicts of interest, but the conflicts of interest are ongoing. So long as there are conflicts of interest, there will be probably ongoing cultural change. The conflicts of interest are not only the source of the cultural inertia, as he says here, cultural inertia derives from the conflicts of interest among individuals and subgroups. Change also derives from the conflict of interest in subgroups. So that may be what he's saying. It's just these aren't as solid stabilizing features, but regardless, he says that means culture as a whole will not be seen as maximizing group interests. Okay, fair. The reinforcement between need and novelty, in other words, the fact that the mutations of culture and the selection of culture are bound up with one another, and we can see what changes need to be made. We can anticipate changes that need to be made, and we can push for those changes. For those reasons, culture changes faster than genetics, although I don't entirely understand how he derives an accelerating cultural change. We certainly seem to see an accelerating cultural change, but I don't know as though he's accurately explained why. But the point is that this continually brings up new ethical challenges for us to face as we're continually being subjected to changing environments, and we haven't solved yesterday's ethical problem by the time we're faced with today's ethical problem. And the ethical problems that are unresolved just continue to multiply. And then he says, many efforts to relate genetic change and cultural change seem mostly to try to seek an explanation as to how the culture and genetics have separated from one another. And in a sense, they have, right? Parts of our culture, some aspects of our culture, could be seen as flying in the face of genetic evolution. The manner in which we try to take from the successful and give to the unsuccessful. I talked about this a little bit in the social Darwinism episode, where there's either survival of the fittest or survival of the unfittest. And if your culture rejects the notion of survival of the fittest and replaces it with notions of egalitarian social change and everyone starting from the same place, everyone ending in the same place, everyone having access to the same things regardless of their ability, that kind of flies in the face of the genetic evolutionary process. So I could see why people would say, well, somehow culture has taken us out of the evolutionary race, out of the evolutionary process, and is veering off in a new and different direction, and we're no longer subject to the same forces that we used to be. I can understand that, but I also can understand his point where he says, really, there's no reason to think that culture and the ways that culture change and grow and the forces that drive culture should really be uncoupled from genetics. Culture is built by people's efforts toward reproduction. Culture is built by people's efforts toward inclusive selection, inclusive fitness, group selection, kin selection, biological drives that cause us to act in certain ways. Those same drives cause us to push culture in certain ways, and the changes that happen in culture can't be divorced from our genetics and our biology. So moving on from there, he talks more about how our behavior as social beings is aimed at our reproductive success. And he says, quote, "There is enough evidence, even in everyday life, to indicate that human social behavior is usually patterned so as to correlate remarkably well with survival, well-being, and reproductive success. If one accepts this evidence, some of which is presented in the next chapter, then the real question becomes, what forces could cause the continued coupling between culture and genes? In fact, we must discover for cultural evolution the nature of the hostile forces, paralleling Darwin's hostile forces of nature, responsible for natural selection's effects on gene frequencies, which differentially favor variations in human social behavior and capacity through the adjustment by individuals and groups, consciously and otherwise, of strategies or styles of life. Few people would doubt that positive and negative reinforcement and responses to reward and punishment are functions of environmental phenomena, reinforcing survival and well-being and avoidance of situations deleterious to survival and well-being. With ordinary physical and biotic stimuli, this relationship is easy to understand. We withdraw from hot stoves, avoid poisonous snakes, seek out tasty foods, appreciate warmth in winter, dislike getting wet in cold rains, etc. What about social stimuli? Should it not be the same? Should we not seek social situations that reward us and avoid those that punish us? Should not the actual definitions of reward and punishment in social behavior, as with responses to physical stimuli, identify for any organism those situations that respectively enhance and diminish its likelihood of social survival and well-being, and in turn its likelihood of reproductive success? Is it not possible that Sheldon was right in suggesting that the reason why many pleasures are wicked is that they frustrate other pleasures? That evil consists in frustrations, as the Thomist says, in privation of one good by another. Is what is pleasurable, hence seems good and right, that which, at least in environments past, maximized genetic reproduction? I suggest so, even to the degree that our pleasure depends upon a capability of judging reactions of others to each of our actions, including the use of planning, self-awareness, and conscience to establish our own personal guidelines to success in sociality." End quote. So here he's just basically saying, more or less, that if you accept the idea that the actions that we take is generally patterned so as to correlate with survival, well-being, and reproductive success. In other words, if you basically accept the idea, which is pretty self-evident, that the things we do in our social environments tend to lead us toward surviving. In other words, we tend to try to work to acquire money, to spend that money on feeding ourselves, right? We do things in society that lead to our survival. We date, we marry, we procreate, we have kids, right? We reproduce within the confines of social structures. We act in society in ways that enhance our survival, our well-being, and our reproductive capacity, right? I mean, that's sort of obvious. Our biological drives don't vanish at the door of civilization. He says, if you accept these things, then the real question becomes, what is the nature of the hostile forces? In other words, the parallel, the social parallel to the hostile forces of nature that act as a selection process on animals in the wild. The threats of predators, the dangers of fire and floods, and the attempts to mate, the tendency of males to, in some circumstances, dominate groups of females and not allow other males to access them. In other words, the dominance hierarchies that exist in nature, the sort of scenarios of nature that act as selection pressures. He says, what really are the social equivalent of these hostile forces of nature? He says, we must discover for cultural evolution the nature of the hostile forces which differentially favor variations in human social behavior and capacity through the adjustment by individuals and groups, consciously and otherwise, of strategies or styles of life. What are the pressures that push us to adjust as individuals or as groups? What push the forces that push us to adapt our strategies and our styles of life? He says essentially in the wild, right, you seek things that reinforce your survival and well-being, and you avoid things that are harmful to your survival and well-being. And we can expect similar things in society. He says, what about social stimuli? Should it not be the same? Should we not seek social situations that reward us and avoid those that punish us? Should not the actual definitions of reward and punishment in social behavior identify for any organism the situations that enhance and diminish the likelihood of social survival and well-being and the likelihood of reproductive success? Well, of course. The social stimuli that reinforce for us that we are getting to a position where we will be more able to survive. Are getting to a position where we will have access to more resources. We will have access to more prestige. We will have greater favor in the eyes of the opposite sex. Things that enhance our survival, our well-being, and our reproductive capacity, those things are considered good in the social circumstances just as much as in nature. And the very concepts of good and evil, right, he points to them being ultimately things that bring us toward genetic reproduction and survival. And I like to kind of relate this to eudaimonia. I've talked about this a little bit before, how not only for individuals but for societies as well. But let's stick with the individuals for a moment. If you think about what Aristotelian eudaimonia is, this human flourishing that's described by eudaimonia, it's happiness, but it's more than happiness. It's flourishing. It's a life well lived. The end that we're after in Greek philosophy is the good. And all beings aim toward the good. All people, all structures, all societies aim toward the good in some way. What is good for us? What is good for me? And what is good for a person is eudaimonia. To be happy, fulfilled, to have adequate levels of sustenance and wealth, right? And you don't have to be rich to achieve eudaimonia, but you can't be poverty-stricken and achieve eudaimonia. You have to be at least financially stable. You have to have friends. You have to have the good things in life. That is eudaimonia. If you have the basic good things in life, you have someone who loves you and you love them, and you have children and you don't suffer great tragedies, then you've achieved eudaimonia. So really, what is eudaimonia but genetic success? It seems kind of like when you really look at it, it's sort of the same thing. Eudaimonia is the combined set of circumstances that would ultimately lead you to the most likely course of action in which you're going to achieve that genetic replication. That is eudaimonia. And so, in a way, our social drive toward eudaimonia is the same as our biological drive toward replication. So let me keep moving from there. One last section in Chapter 2 before I tackle a little bit of Chapter 3. And he talks a little bit about genetic traits, about cultural traits and the nature of cultural forces and actions. He says, quote, I suggest that the rates and directions of mutability and heritability in culture are determined by the collective interests and compromises of interests of the individuals striving at any particular place or time, together with the form and degree of inertia in the cultural environment as a result of its history. That the hostile forces resulting in cultural change have tended increasingly to be conflicts of interest among human individuals and subgroups in securing relief from Darwin's hostile forces of nature, and that, among these hostile forces of nature, increasingly prominent and eventually paramount, have been what amounted to predators in the form of other humans, acting as individuals or in groups with at least temporary commonality of interests. These arguments lead to 4 expectations. 1. A reasonably close correspondence between the structure of culture and its usefulness to individuals in inclusive fitness maximizing. 2. An even closer correlation between the overall structure of culture and those traits that benefit everyone about equally, or benefit the great majority. 3. Extremely effective capabilities of individuals to mold themselves to fit their cultural milieu. And 4. Tendencies for culture to be so structured as to resist substantial alteration by individuals and subgroups in their own interests and contrary to those of others. These predictions lead us to analyze the variations in culture as the potential outcomes of different strategies of inclusive fitness maximizing behavior in different circumstances. They also suggest that the proximate or immediate physiological and social mechanisms whereby inclusive fitness is maximized are potential explanations of the degrees and directions by which cultural patterns diverge from actual inclusive fitness maximizing behaviors when technological or other changes rapidly create evolutionarily novel environments. End quote. So let's review this section. Walking through this, he says that, first he's reiterating what we've already looked at in depth here, that the directions of mutation and heritability in culture are determined by the interests and compromises of the interests of individuals striving at any particular place or time, in combination with the force and degree of cultural inertia. So the sort of competing, in some sense, the competing factors here are the existence of cultural inertia, which I've described, and the continual conflict of interest of individuals who are each trying to push and pull culture to benefit them a little bit more and to get the most out of it. And that's really what drives the mutation and heritability of culture. And he says that the hostile forces that people are trying to avoid, he says we're still all kind of trying to avoid in a way the hostile forces of nature. In other words, none of us are willing to starve to death. None of us are willing to freeze in the cold. We still are faced ultimately with these natural environmental factors, the hostile forces of nature. And we're competing with one another for the resources that we need to avoid being subject to these hostile forces of nature. In other words, shelter and the capacity to continue to acquire additional resources and the capacity to procreate. He says, increasingly, the nature of the hostile forces of nature is predators in the form of other humans, acting as individuals or acting as in groups with a temporary commonality of interests. In other words, either a single person out there who wants something from us or could potentially be a threat to us, or groups of people who could potentially be a threat to us. This often involves other nations, right? So a large part of our civilization is doing what is necessary, acquiring the necessary resources to hold other nations at bay, hold other tribes at bay, other kingdoms at bay. The constant state of nature or struggling between nation states ultimately acts as a major driving factor of the shape of civilization. Although we may not see it every day right in front of us, right? We have to continue working, paying taxes, having some sort of a military force in order to prevent the things that we have from being taken by others. There is ultimately an ongoing struggle between people, between tribes, between groups of people, between different kin groups who are struggling with one another for access to the resources of the world. Okay, that's kind of the nature of the challenges that we face in the modern world. He says this can lead us to 4 expectations that would characterize. I think that these 4 expectations, I should specify, would characterize a successful nation. A nation that doesn't meet these 4 characterizations, these 4 qualities, may exist, but not for long. Not all nations are successful, and a nation or a society or a group of people that fits more closely with these 4 traits would probably be one that would have a bright future. And a society that goes against these 4 qualities would be a society that is setting itself up for trouble. So looking at these 4 qualities, he says, we can see these arguments lead to 4 expectations. Number 1, a reasonably close correspondence between the structure of culture and its usefulness to individuals in inclusive fitness maximizing. So that means that a successful culture is going to have a reasonably close correspondence. So as I said before, if a culture isn't facilitating reproduction, then it's not going to be a successful culture. And not only that, but he specifically says inclusive fitness maximizing. So a culture needs to enable you to advance your interests. It needs to enable you to also work to advance the interests of your family members. It needs to enable you to work to build a intergenerational wealth. If society stymies your capacity to set your children up with an advantage, then society is stymieing your ability to participate in inclusive fitness maximizing. If it prevents you from grouping up with your family members or with your kin to advance your interests, then society is stymieing your natural biological genetic drives. And as a result, that society is not going to be as functional and is going to set itself up for some sort of internal conflict, likely. Number 2 would be an even closer correlation between the overall structure of culture and those traits that benefit everyone about equally, or benefit the great majority. In other words, a society that sets itself up to maximize the inclusive fitness of some small group, but most people find themselves stymied, that's trouble. It has to, if it's not going to face revolution, or if it's going to be able to have some sort of cultural unity that would enable it to withstand threats from without, then everybody has to be on board. If huge portions of the society feel like they're getting shafted by some small, powerful minority, then you're setting your society up for trouble. Now, I've got certain qualms with democracy and egalitarianism, and I have a certain amount of respect for aristocracy and monarchy and things like that, and I can see that there are benefits to having a hierarchical society. But at the same time, let's not look at this through some sort of rose-tinted glasses. If you have huge portions of people who are disenfranchised, who feel that they don't have a say in the way culture looks, who feel that culture is not set up for them, but is set up for the benefit of the few and at the detriment of the many, you're not going to have a society that is going to be able to be unified or successful. The members of society, all of them, are in a perpetual conflict with one another. They're together for the purposes of withholding the hostile forces of nature, but their binding together is not permanent. It's not a part of fundamental reality. It can always be dissolved. Strife and dissolution are always around the corner, and if the society doesn't involve all of its members, or the great majority of its members, into the society and make them feel as if they're benefiting from the society, then you've got trouble down the road. The third one, extremely effective capabilities of individuals to mold themselves to fit their cultural milieu. And this is pretty obvious. Most people are just innately capable of adopting the cultural norms around them. They don't even have to try. They learn the language, they learn the mannerisms. This all happens in childhood, and this is part of human nature. And I don't think this is something, as much as the others, that would really cause a society to collapse because it's just so automatic. But certainly the possibility exists of, I talked about the accelerating cultural change. If aspects of culture are changing so rapidly that people can't keep up and they feel left behind by shifting culture, or they feel like they no longer want to adapt, if the adoption that takes place in childhood to fit themselves into their culture, what we all go through in our childhood of socialization, if that, as you get older, suddenly becomes inadequate, and despite the fact that you have immersed yourself in your society, you still find yourself 10, 15, 20 years later standing outside of society, you're going to have, again, a society that's headed for trouble. People have to be able to acclimate themselves to their societies without a tremendous amount of effort and without a tremendous amount of discomfort. And that should be just a natural phenomena, but in the face of rapidly shifting culture, people can become detached from their own culture through no fault of their own. The fourth one is tendencies for culture to be so structured as to resist substantial alteration by individuals and subgroups in their own interest and contrary to those of others. So this is the cultural inertia. The cultural inertia is a critical component. The fact that culture changes over time is good, and it enables culture to adapt to changing circumstances, to develop new technologies, and just evolve. Evolution doesn't happen without change, but it should have a sort of inertia to it. That's a necessary thing for culture to be strong. Let's reread. He says, the tendency for culture to be so structured as to resist substantial alteration. So, like, for example, our Constitution. The United States Constitution has a mechanism for change, but it's somewhat laborious. It's somewhat onerous to go through the process. It's not that it's unchangeable. It's not that it's perfectly static, like set in stone and can never be changed, but it's deliberately sort of difficult to change because otherwise it has no stability. It blows over in the slightest breeze. You want it to sort of stand the test of time. You want the change to be sort of slow. That cultural inertia, for the reasons I've described, is actually a very important component for a nation or a society to be able to identify itself as distinct from other peoples and societies and other nations. To be able to say, this is who we are, and not mean some sort of universal value that not only is this who we are, but really this is who everybody is, that we are, whatever humanity is, that's what we are. That's not distinct from other people, and it has to be distinct, and the only way it achieves this distinctness is by holding fast to something, holding fast to the things that have developed from prior times. So, I think that's all very interesting. Now let me jump to chapter 3. He gives a sort of a summary first of the things that he has said so far. I'm just going to read through this summary and just kind of reiterate what we've looked at. He says, quote, "The conclusion that society is a consequence of individuals pursuing their genetic interests is discomforting not only to those who have consistently searched for function at group levels in human affairs, but equally so to community ecologists and other biologists whose research has been similarly directed. The implication in both cases is that the evolutionary significance of function is not to be found at high levels. This is a distressing outcome to those who have sought particular kinds of simplifying generalizations to account for the complexity of organization of life. Thus, it seems incredible to suggest that all principles regarding ecosystems, communities, ecological succession, interspecific interactions, and the patterns of culture must derive from natural selection focused at or below the individual level. I think, however, that for non-human phenomena, we are already forced to this conclusion, and that it is at least the best hypothesis for human sociality and culture. I have also argued that cultural evolution differs from genetic evolution because it incorporates a feedback between the needs of the organisms and the sources of novelty and behavior. The cause of change and the causes of the spread and persistence of change are not independent. The mutations of culture, discovery, invention, and planning are directional, and their heritability is adjustable on the basis of their suitability. To understand directions and rates of cultural change, then, we must concentrate not on heritability as such, but on who or what causes and keeps the mutations of culture and on what basis. I have suggested that culture is kept on track by the interests of individuals, and not by the interests of populations or species, except in the case that the interests of the individuals comprising them are shared. That it represents the collective effect of all individuals trying as best they can to match their perceptions of their own best interests, whether these are conscious or somehow unconscious. The nature of their perceptions is the ingredient omitted from the formulations of cultural determinists. I have suggested further that human individuals, like other organisms, have evolved to interpret their best interests, not necessarily consciously, in terms of reproductive maximization. It should follow that even the environmental novelties introduced by culture will not often be irrelevant to reproduction, and that their interpretations by the actors in any system will never be irrelevant to the history of reproduction. I have argued that the difficulties experienced by culture theorists are to be expected, given that the aspects of culture which give it a group flavor, its temporal inertia, and its spatial patterning, are incidental outcomes of the collective effects of generations of individual humans pursuing their personal reproductive interests. Individuals who have, nevertheless, been under the constraints of continual social scrutiny from others, always with somewhat different interests. I have not suggested that culture precisely tracks the interests of the genes. Obviously, this is not true. But that, in historical terms, it does so much more closely than we might have imagined, and that for the future, our enlightenment on this point is almost certain to reduce the extent to which culture follows the interests of the genes and increase the extent to which it tracks instead our phenotypic interests as individuals and social collectives. At least for humans unaware of their reproductive history, then, culture will remain paradoxically both the handmaiden of the genes and the obligate and not always optimal environment of their reproduction. In my opinion, for humans who understand their history, reproduction is likely to be bypassed deliberately, and often with relief. In its place, we are likely to see the substitution of a combination of reduced reproduction and increased attention to more direct phenotypic satisfactions. I see no possibility that the genetic changes selection will inevitably engender against such tendencies can even remotely approach, in pace, the acceleration of technological changes abetting them." End quote. So I'm not going to go over an awful lot of this. Much of it is restating some of the things that he stated earlier that I had covered earlier. the connection, but not the precise connection of culture and genes, the individual interests that are driving cultural change. But what I think is interesting is the end. I'm going to reread much of this last paragraph, and I want to look at it in a little bit of detail. He says, I'll read this whole last paragraph again, and listen closely. He says, I have not suggested that culture precisely tracks the interests of the genes. Obviously, this is not true. But that, in historical terms, it does so much more closely than we might have imagined. Okay, so far so good. Culture doesn't exactly track the interests of the genes, but in historical terms, it does quite a bit track the interests of the genes. He says, for the future, our enlightenment on this point is almost certain to reduce the extent to which culture follows the interests of the genes, and increase the extent to which it tracks instead our phenotypic interests as individual and social collectives. So what does that mean? He says, our enlightenment on the point that culture is not exactly bound up with genes. I'm assuming that's the point that he's meaning, that culture does not precisely track the genes, but historically it has tracked the genes quite a bit, although not exactly. So apparently our enlightenment on that point is almost certain to reduce the extent to which culture follows the interests of the genes, and increase the extent to which it tracks instead our phenotypic interests as individual and social collectives. In other words, I don't entirely know how he makes the connection between his first point and his second point, but essentially for the future, he says we're going to see a reduction in the extent to which culture follows the interests of the genes. So our drives toward reproduction, our drives toward kin selection, our drives toward our own survival, the things that our genetic code demands of us. Culture will stop catering to our genetic needs and begin to cater instead to our phenotypic interests. That means our phenotype is our body, right? Our genotype is our genetic code. Our phenotype is the manifestation of that genetic code in a body. So he's ultimately talking about bodily interests. Stepping away from our genetic interests and towards our bodily interests, which seems much more like immediate pleasure and satisfaction. And the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the capacity to have sex without creating children. So to step away from the genetic drive that pushes us towards sex and into the bodily drive, which is not so much for reproduction, although there is to some extent, there's a desire for babies, especially women. They like babies, they want to have babies, but more so, particularly among men, we're at a drive toward physical contact, toward physical sex. We're not following the genetic code so much as we follow the phenotypic code. Now, in a environment where there's low technology and a somewhat primitive society, when we follow our phenotypic demands, we invariably also follow our genetic demands. But as society gets more complicated, we can follow our bodily demands and divorce them from our genetic demands. We don't feel compelled to follow our genetic demands, not exactly. What we feel compelled toward is to follow our biological demands. And he says that it's certain, this enlightenment on this point is certain to reduce the extent to which culture follows the interests of the genes and increase the extent to which it tracks instead our phenotypic interests as individuals and social collectives. He says, at least for humans unaware of their reproductive history, then, culture will remain paradoxically both the handmaiden of the genes and the obligate, if not always optimal, environment of their reproduction. Okay, that's kind of self-explanatory. Culture both helps us fulfill our genetic drives as well as provides us with the environment, which is sometimes helpful and sometimes not helpful, in which we make those strivings. He says, in my opinion, for humans who understand their history, reproduction is likely to be bypassed deliberately and often with relief In its place, we are likely to see the substitution of a combination of reduced reproduction and increased attention to more direct phenotypic satisfactions. Okay, that's kind of restating what I had said previously, reducing the combination of reduced reproduction, less actual childbearing, and increased attention to more direct phenotypic, aka bodily satisfactions. He says, I see no possibility that the genetic changes selection will inevitably engender against such tendencies can even remotely approach, in pace, the acceleration of technological changes abetting them. So in other words, evolution would, genetic evolution would select against such things, right? Obviously, genetic evolution will select against people choosing not to reproduce, choosing instead to fulfill their bodily satisfaction and having at most one child or probably none, and instead just satisfying their physical desires. Evolution will select against that. However, the technological change that facilitates such a lifestyle is faster and more powerful, and he doesn't see the genetic, he says, I see no possibility that genetic changes selection will inevitably engender against such tendencies can even remotely approach and pace the acceleration of technological changes abetting them. So while over time, if given enough time, we would develop genetic changes that would inoculate us against these sorts of tendencies to pursue bodily pleasures instead of genetic drives, right? Given enough time, there's a sort of selection process that says, well, that's not going to work. That's going to be genetically selected against, and some other genetic mutation or some other form of genetic directive would overcome that, would step in and cause us to no longer pursue such an approach, right? If something is selected against, if a tendency is selected against, then it vanishes, and some other more effective tendency will take its place. But the tendency can't be selected against and replaced with a new tendency fast enough, because technology is making such a course of action inevitable, because it advances so fast and is so thorough and so predominant in society. That sounds like a catastrophic circumstance. It sounds like we're just going to completely give up on our own genetic replication, and we're going to make this complete suicidal maneuver with the helpful assistance of technology. Technology essentially facilitates our genetic suicide, and we will happily go right along with it. That sounds pretty scary. So I'm going to jump to the next section. He talks a little bit about kin groups here, the human network of kin. He says, quote, an evolutionary model predicts then that viscous social groups, like human societies, should be extraordinarily complex networks of nepotistic interactions. It is of paramount importance that this is true for humans. At the base of every known human society, there is a kinship system in which genetic relationships are an essential ingredient. Every human, from birth, is embedded in such a network. Indeed, social anthropologists have always regarded it as their central role to examine human kinship systems and analyze their structure and functions. Earlier, I suggested that social psychology would someday recognize as a central task the explanation of all the forms and contexts of social learning as mechanisms of inclusive fitness maximizing. Here, I suggest that social anthropology will someday recognize that one of its central tasks is explaining variations in social behavior and in the patterns of culture as outcomes of inclusive fitness maximizing. When humans began to live continuously in social groups, within which they could distinguish relatives of differing degree, two new selective forces were added to their social life, as compared to that of most other species. First, numerous and varied extrafamilial relatives became reproductive resources as both sources and targets of nepotism, and second, genetic outbreeding beyond the limits of the nuclear family became possible because information about the differing degrees of relatedness of extrafamilial relatives became potentially available to every individual. Assuming the situation described in the above paragraphs to be the case, and taking a modern view of Darwinian selection, several genetic predictions about human nepotism are evident, and numerous subsidiary predictions emerge. For example, we expect that patterns of kinship will be centrally important in human societies, and that humans will behave in predictable ways toward different genetic kin. We expect keen ability to sense differences in the needs of kin and to respond to them. Similarly, we may expect cleverness in detecting availability of nepotistic benefits and in diverting them to personal benefit, even sometimes by deception. Such deception may take two forms. One, efforts to insinuate oneself into the role of a closer than actual relative, and two, efforts to exaggerate one's need or ability to use sought-after benefits in reproduction. In turn, we should become very sensitive to all such efforts at deception, and very clever at avoiding nepotism unlikely to yield maximal reproductive returns. We should expect that assistance to kin on one's own terms should represent one of the most potent of all sources of pleasure and satisfaction. End quote. So he's essentially describing what we should expect to find, not in some future state, although it sounds like sounds like he's describing a future state. He's really describing what we should expect to find the more we examine human nepotism, the more we examine human kin selection and inclusive fitness. And essentially, he's basically saying that the more we look at human societies, the more important we're going to find kin selection and nepotism to be. The more we're going to realize the extent to which societies are fundamentally built around kin groups, and human behavior is fundamentally driven, shaped in the past as well as the present by efforts at kin selection and inclusive fitness. And the interesting thing is that this has been the mode of human behavior for so long, and the modern liberal viewpoint is one that utterly demonizes the very processes by which we got to where we currently are. All of the things that he says we should expect to find as we look into human societies, all of those things are, in a way, sort of demonized by modern liberalism. And I don't just mean like the progressivism of today, although that is certainly the uber liberal, the ultimate manifestation of liberalism, but the tendencies toward the annihilation of kin selection and the demonization of kin selection, the origins of this can be found right back in the Enlightenment, and has been slowly unfolding from then till now. So that's where I'm going to leave off, and thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.